First question.
So this is about the climate change episode.
Yeah. So did you have a clear idea when you started about a narrative or a message that was going to run through the show before you started it?
Well, I've been doing climate change activism, or been concerned about climate change in that kind of a way for many years. So this whole discourse of thinking about climate change and that something needs to be done is one that I'm very used to, and one that I'm very attached to, I guess, as a person. So I had all sorts of vague ideas about what I wanted it to say. I was very strongly thinking that it should say that we're crazy for not doing enough about climate change, and some of the most common changes that are being presented in the kind of mainstream debate by the government and by private companies and by a lot of more mainstream charities and lobbying groups as well, that those solutions are not the solutions that are going to genuinely, deal with this massive problem that we're facing. So yeah, I came from a very situated, like a very sort of biased point of view in making that programme. And that's what I wanted it to say, that's why I wanted to make the show. And the people I kind of picked to talk in the programme, I picked them because I thought that they would say this thing that I wanted them to say. But it was actually really interesting in the case of Alf Hornberg, the Swedish philosopher. He ended up saying things that I did not expect him to say at all. And that was just because I hadn't researched properly what he was going to say, because these are things that he's been saying for ages, for years and years. But he, for example, as he expresses in the programme, he's quite cynical about the future or extremely cynical about the future, and thinks that it's quite unlikely that the type of social changes that need to happen will happen. And so I wasn't really prepared for that, and when I was interviewing him via the phone, he works in Sweden, and I was interviewing him from my flat in London, and he kind of said that, and I went, oh God, what am I going to do with this sort of thing? Which is from my perspective, and I'm not saying that I'm right or he's wrong, or it's just that I came from this point of view and he came with this other point of view, and then I had to decide in the editing how to deal with that. Like here's me being a climate activist, going to protests and doing all these other, lobbying for these social changes to happen, and here's this professor saying, like, basically there's no point. And so that was really difficult for me to deal with, but at the same time so interesting and so important, and I think it really, really added a lot to the programme. But it was very awkward for me how to deal with that from a very personal perspective. But obviously he's an extremely well-researched, he's an expert about it, so he had thought a lot about it, so there was a lot to take from. But yeah, that was the main kind of point at which I felt like I got really troubled by what the show was actually saying. And then the other two people that I interviewed, Danny, who's an old friend of mine, and I've been to some activisty things with and just known him for years and years. So I kind of knew more about what he was going to say. And the last guy is Gavin, who I met at a conference, and he gave a presentation about his project. And I thought that it was really awesome, and I really wanted to do something. I kind of heard about this project and went, whoa, this is crazy. People should hear about this. And so I thought he could talk in this program as well. And that nicely linked climate change, the problem, with new avenues or new ways of thinking about what the solution to climate change could be.
So did you end up editing out a lot of material then, or did you actually leave it in because of the nuances? To leave those kind of counter,
Yeah, I didn't feel like I left out any sort of main criticisms of my own opinion, and that's always the hard thing when you're I'm not a particularly experienced documentary maker, but I've learned in this process of making these shows that it's, that's the big question that you're dealing with, is how much do you let it be a mouthpiece for you and what you think, and how much are you just an observer going, that's interesting and that's interesting, which is also true for academia actually, which is what my day job is. But I don't feel that I left out any sort of major points of view or any major arguments, not at all. But I had to leave out, the interviews that I did were roughly about an hour each, And so there was 3 of them. So I think the one with Gavin was like 1.5 hours or even longer. So inevitably I had to edit out loads of material and loads of nuance, and especially stories of them explaining how they got interested in this and what makes them motivated to carry on doing something about this. So that was a shame I had to exclude that. But I guess when you make a documentary like that, to a certain extent you have to decide on a narrative that it's going to take, and you have to decide that this is what because when I started making it I didn't have a clear idea about what exactly the topic was going to be. I kind of just thought it was going to be about climate change, and then I just started interviewing people and found what the most interesting thread going through all of that was, which was what kind of social changes do we need in order to make sure that we do something about climate change. So there's a lot of other stuff that I didn't manage to include, but some of it kind of became this other program which was about activism, which happens later on in the series, about how can citizens in Britain or people in here try to do something to affect big issues like that, which goes far, far beyond protesting, by the way. But
That's show number 4, isn't it?
Yeah.
In the series.